When people think of the Crusades, they usually think of noble knights and grand battles, a glorious struggle between East and West, an honest, just war. But there's a darkness to this period that is often overlooked. Between 1096 and 1291 AD, the Crusades, a series of wars instigated by Christian kingdoms in Europe to wrestle back control of Jerusalem from the Muslim Saracens, were marked by intense violence, fanaticism, and lasting consequences for both the Eastern and Western worlds. Stripping away the romanticized version reveals a savage history filled with mass killings, rapes, pillaging, cannibalism, relentless sieges, and deep-seated animosities that still reverberate today. Still, these were the epic battles of the age, where both sides believed they had God on their side, and that the non-believers before them should be crushed mercilessly. This period saw the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, and in the end, very little had changed. However, the Crusades are not some distant catastrophe without relevance to the modern world. What happened during those years is still used by leaders, nations, and religious fanatics to urge action and division between Christians and Muslims today. In the late autumn of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont in France and issued a call that would change history. It was a call to arms, a plea that captured the fervent religious spirit of the time and channeled it toward a singular goal: reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Pope's words were like a spark thrown into dry tinder. He painted a vivid picture of Christianity suffering in the Holy Land, appealing to his audience's spiritual devotion and warrior impulses. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Knights and peasants alike vowed to take up the cross, urged on by promises of spiritual reward and the lure of adventure. However, while some saw it as a purely pious mission, others recognized it as an opportunity for political gain, land acquisition, or escape from dire circumstances at home. This initial surge, known as the People's Crusade, was far less organized and more chaotic than its successors. Led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, thousands of ordinary men, women, and children set off toward Jerusalem with little preparation or understanding of the obstacles ahead. What followed can only be described as a tragic misadventure. Without adequate supplies or military discipline, many of these crusaders resorted to looting and violence to sustain themselves. As they progressed through Eastern Europe towards Byzantium, they clashed repeatedly with local populations and even fellow Christians, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Anti-Semitism also erupted along this deadly path as crusaders began targeting anybody who wasn't a Christian. The worst of these came to be known as the Rhineland massacres, where as many as 2,000 Jews were killed during attacks on Jewish communities in cities such as Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. On the 27th of May, 1096, more than 1,000 Jews were slaughtered when crusaders breached the walls of Mainz and pent-up hatred swept through the city. In contrast to the chaos of the People's Crusade, the Prince's Crusade brought together seasoned knights under the banners of European nobility. Figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto led well-equipped armies genuinely motivated by faith, feudal obligations, and the promise of new lands. What began as a series of strategic campaigns gradually degenerated into savagery that simultaneously pitted armies against several sides. At the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, the Crusaders fought fiercely against the Seljuk Turks, but also with their supposed allies in the Byzantine Empire. The Siege of Antioch, which lasted from October 1097 to June 1098, has come to symbolize the Crusaders' harrowing experiences, as Antioch initially proved nearly impregnable, surrounded by formidable walls and guarded by a determined Turkish defense. As food supplies dwindled, the besieging army descended into despair. Famine, disease, and constant combat took a heavy toll. Reports emerged of Crusaders eating horses, roots, and even rats to stave off starvation. The situation grew increasingly dire until a treacherous plot from within the city finally enabled the Crusaders to breach the defenses. Once inside, the Crusaders unleashed a ferocious slaughter upon Antioch's inhabitants. Thousands of Muslims and suspected traitors died in the ensuing chaos. The victory, though celebrated, left a horrifying scar. As they neared the Holy Land, things worsened for everybody involved. One event stands out in its brutality: the Siege of Marat al-Numan, which began in late November 1098. The city's fortifications and the determination of its inhabitants made it a challenging target. The Crusaders employed various siege tactics, including constructing towers and digging under the walls, but it was an agonizing process intensified by struggles with logistics and supply issues. The onset of winter exacerbated their difficulties, causing food shortages and plummeting morale. The besieged town's defenders were equally desperate, facing the prospect of certain death if they could not repel the attackers. One of the most shocking aspects of the siege was the reports of cannibalism among the Crusaders, with sources describing how some Crusaders consumed the flesh of their fallen enemies and local inhabitants to survive. It was a hellish situation, both inside and outside the walls. After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting and negotiation attempts, the Crusaders breached the walls of Murat al-Numan on the 11th of December 1098 and massacred a significant portion of the population, showing little mercy to the inhabitants, where the combatants saw civilians. Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, fell to the Crusaders on the 15th of July 1099. The attack was swift and merciless. After breaking through the city's fortifications, the Crusaders embarked on a killing spree that spared neither gender nor age. Contemporary accounts describe rivers of blood running through the streets as the invaders wreaked vengeance down on those inside. While exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, it's thought that as many as 70,000 Jews and Muslims died in Jerusalem when it fell to the Christians. It was a massacre on an absolutely shocking scale. While capturing Jerusalem fulfilled the religious and strategic goals of the crusade, the way it was done left an ugly legacy that has forever lingered. This was a triumph for Christendom, but the sheer brutality of the events revealed a moral ambiguity that has haunted the Crusades ever since. In the early 12th century, Western Europe was in a state of religious fervor, largely thanks to the persuasive power of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Known for his devout piety and unyielding commitment to the Christian faith, Bernard was instrumental in reigniting the zeal that led to thousands more taking up the cross. His rhetoric, steeped in religious conviction, heavily fanned the flames of intolerance and hatred towards Muslims and Jews, casting them as the infidel other that threatened Christendom. At this point, Jerusalem was still in Christian hands, but the Holy Lands had become a near constant battleground between East and West, between Christian and Muslim. The Crusaders' initial march was again fraught with logistical challenges and mounting tensions, and on the 1st of July 1147, they walked into a devastating ambush at Dorylaeum. As they trudged through Anatolia's harsh and unfamiliar terrain, they were set upon by highly maneuverable Seljuk Turkish forces. Heavily laden and unprepared for such swift attacks, the Crusaders were caught off guard. The ensuing battle was chaotic and brutal. The Seljuks employed hit-and-run tactics, exploiting their superior knowledge of the land and their light cavalry to harass and decimate the Crusader ranks. Caught in the open, burdened by heavy armor and cumbersome supply lines, the European knights struggled to mount an effective defense. Panic spread quickly, leading to a disastrous rout. Many Crusaders were killed on the spot, while others were taken captive, only to face grim fates later. It was a humiliating defeat that shattered the morale of the crusading army and exposed the severe shortcomings in their preparation and strategy. Following the debacle at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders sought to regroup and focus their efforts on a new target, Damascus. The ancient city was strategically significant, providing a gateway to further conquests in the Holy Land. What initially seemed like a promising objective quickly turned into another tragic miscalculation. When the Crusaders laid siege to Damascus in late July 1148, they faced fierce resistance from the city's defenders. Within days, it became apparent that the siege was unsustainable. The Crusaders withdrew in disarray, suffering from hunger, disease, and continuous counterattacks. The ignominious retreat marked another significant failure, severely undermining the credibility of the crusading cause. The catastrophic defeats at Dorylaeum and Damascus had far-reaching implications. News of the failures trickled back to Europe, dampening the initial enthusiasm that St. Bernard had so effectively kindled. Participation in the Crusades began to wane as many questioned the wisdom of embarking on what increasingly seemed like a hopeless endeavor. The lofty promise of glory and divine fervor stood in stark contrast to the grim realities faced by crusading armies. This period saw a marked decline in both financial and manpower support. European monarchs and noblemen who had previously enthusiastically endorsed the Crusades now found themselves grappling with the political and economic fallout of these costly campaigns. Resources were stretched thin, and public opinion grew increasingly skeptical. The inherent contradictions of waging wars in the name of peace became painfully evident, weakening the moral authority that proponents of the Crusades leveraged. By the mid-12th century, everything had changed. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had unified Muslim forces in the region and aimed to reclaim Jerusalem from the Crusaders, who had held the city since 1099. The pivotal Battle of Hattin on the 4th of July 1187 saw Saladin's forces defeat the Crusader army decisively. This victory left the Crusader states vulnerable, allowing Saladin to advance toward Jerusalem unopposed. The siege of Jerusalem began on the 20th of September 1187. Balian of Ibelin defended the city, rallying a relatively small force of knights, soldiers, and civilian volunteers to hold off Saladin's much larger army. Despite their determined defense, the Crusaders were vastly outnumbered and lacked sufficient resources to endure a prolonged siege. On the 2nd of October, 1187, Saladin agreed to remarkably lenient terms compared to the standards of the time. Instead of the wholesale massacre that had occurred when the Crusaders took the city in 1099, Saladin allowed for the peaceful transfer of Jerusalem to Muslim control. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem wasn't just another battle won, it resonated deeply through all layers of society. From kings to commoners, the news triggered a range of emotions, from despair and confusion to a renewed call for crusades. Taking this as a personal affront, the Pope began rallying European leaders to reclaim the Holy City. This collective outrage marked the beginning of the Third Crusade. This final crusade would pit two names against each other that still resonate throughout history: Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. These two titans were not merely generals, but symbols of their respective civilizations. Richard was seen as the definition of chivalry, while Saladin represented Islamic honor and strength. It was an epic struggle, and one that brought despair to both sides. The Siege of Acre from 1189 to 1191 was about as bad as it could possibly get. Acre was a fortified coastal city and a key strategic point, and the Crusaders threw themselves against it for the best part of 3 years. On both sides of the walls, thousands of soldiers huddled through scorching summers and freezing winters. Disease became as much an enemy as the opposing army, decimating both the besiegers and the besieged. Both armies spared no one. Skirmishes often dissolved into slaughter, and prisoners were brutally executed to instill terror. While the Crusades were able to finally take Acre, victory came at a high price. The suffering endured was monumental, casting a dark shadow over the entire campaign. And yet, that was just the beginning. One of the most chilling episodes of the Third Crusade is arguably the massacre at Ayadir in 1191. After capturing Acre, Richard negotiated the release of Christian prisoners in exchange for a hefty ransom, but tensions simmered when Saladin delayed payment. Enraged and frustrated, Richard ordered the mass execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. For Christian prisoners, Saladin's vengeance was swift. 1,600 were put to death in Damascus, while untold numbers in chains through the Middle East were tortured before being killed. Saladin also ordered his men to destroy crops, poison wells, and burn villages along the Crusaders' route. These tactics weren't just about depriving Richard's army of resources, they were psychological warfare intended to sap the morale of the invading forces. Saladin's strategy invoked severe hardships on the Crusaders, who found themselves increasingly desperate as supplies dwindled. After years of fighting, disease, and immense losses on both sides, the Third Crusade reached an anticlimactic conclusion. Neither Richard nor Saladin could claim outright victory. Despite some significant wins for the Crusaders, like reclaiming several coastal cities, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 officially ended hostilities, stipulating that Christians could freely visit Jerusalem for pilgrimage, but it would remain under Muslim control. The conclusion left many disillusioned. For all the sacrifices made, the thousands who had died, the ultimate goal of recapturing Jerusalem hadn't been achieved. While future crusades would be launched, the Third Crusade's disappointing end marked a significant turning point. It heralded a shift from grandiose ambitions of conquest to more pragmatic approaches in subsequent conflicts. The Crusades, often romanticized as noble quests for religious salvation, came at a horrifying cost for everybody. Massacres of Muslim and Jewish populations, the sack of cities, the episodes of cannibalism, such as during the siege of Marat and Al-Numan, highlighted the devastating human cost of these campaigns that aimed to bring Christianity back to the Holy Land. While they were driven by a profound sense of religious zeal and a desire to reclaim a place thousands of miles from home, the Crusades should really be remembered for their extreme violence, brutality, and acts of atrocity that left deep scars on the societies involved. Furthermore, the Crusades intensified religious hatred and conflict, setting a precedent for centuries of Christian-Muslim animosity. Almost since the Crusades, people have been using the example of the Crusades to justify their actions on both Christian and Muslim sides. The concept of a just Christian war or a jihad has become scarily common, and the Crusades are where all these notions took root. Hitler admired the Crusades as an example of European unity, as martial valor. He saw them as a historical precedent for the German expansionist ideology. Hitler believed that just as the Crusaders fought to reclaim the Holy Lands, the Germans were destined to conquer and colonize Eastern Europe to provide space for the Aryan race. The Crusades were sometimes referenced in Nazi propaganda to evoke a sense of historical destiny and righteous struggle. By drawing parallels between the Crusades and the Nazi campaigns, Hitler aimed to mobilize the German population by appealing to a sense of historical mission and destiny. This helped to frame the Nazi war efforts as part of a larger, noble struggle, tapping into historical narratives of religious and cultural conflict. There's also Osama bin Laden, who frequently referenced the Crusades in his rhetoric to frame contemporary Western military interventions in the Middle East as a continuation of the medieval Christian Crusades against Islam. He portrayed the United States and its allies as crusaders bent on destroying Islam and oppressing Muslims. ISIS leaders, including Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, have extensively used the imagery and language of the Crusades to frame their jihadist propaganda. They depicted Western military interventions and support for Middle Eastern governments as a modern crusade against Islam. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, US President George W. Bush inadvertently invoked the Crusades during a speech when he referred to the war on terror as a crusade. Although he later clarified that he did not intend to evoke the historical Crusades, the reference was widely criticized and perceived as inflammatory, particularly in the Muslim world. Then there's Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian far-right terrorist who carried out the 2011 attacks in Norway. He explicitly framed his actions as part of a modern crusade against Islam and multiculturalism. In his manifesto, he called himself a modern-day crusader and sought to inspire a nationalist and anti-Muslim movement in Europe. By the end of the 13th century, the Crusades had all petered out. But what happened continues to echo through time. These were not just honorable wars that pitted good against evil, they were bloodbaths that saw the deaths of anywhere between 3 and 6 million